Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about evolution. Evolution really is the culminating topic that really brings everything we've talked about together. So as we've talked about biochemistry and cells, and we've built our way up to talk about genetics, when we want to talk about more of the large-scale stuff, the macro ideas opposed to the micro ideas that we really start out with, it all comes to evolution, which eventually goes on to deal with ecology and the way that different organisms interact. But ecology, evolution, they really go hand in hand. It's hard to separate the two. When we talk about evolution, we're really talking about a change over a long period of time. And that's all we're saying. It's a very long period of time. We're talking about millions and millions of years. So a lot of times people get caught up talking about evolution and thinking, you know what, this doesn't make sense. One thing is not going to have an offspring that is a completely different organism. And no one is saying that. No one is saying that your parents were chimpanzees or your grandparents were chimpanzees or anything like that. That the somewhere along the lineage recently and in the past 100 years, one of your family members was a great ape and you became a human. No one's saying that, but we're saying gradual changes over a very long period of time, millions and millions of years, they really add up, and that is where we see that an organism is going to descend into another organism. So just as a basic idea of talking about evolution, well, where is it that we see evolution? And we see evolution when we talk about selection. And the biggest one that we like to talk about is natural selection. And natural selection is when the environment is doing the selecting of which organisms will live and which organisms will die or not live long enough to reproduce. And this is all based on the traits that you have. And obviously that reflects on your genetics because we talk about phenotype, and phenotype is from the genotype. So while we like to talk about phenotype, how the phenotype is going to interact with the environment, how your traits are going to interact with your environment, we know that traits are coming from the genetics. So now we see that bridge between genetics and evolution. So just as an experiment to try to wrap our minds around what exactly is evolution, how is it that traits are going to be selected for, we could do an experiment with fruit flies. And you could breed fruit flies relatively quickly and try to really play with selecting which trait you want to make it to the next generation and which one isn't, which one can't. So could you breed fruit flies that can withstand going without food for more than 20 hours? Could you breed fruit flies that all of them could do that? So if I have fruit flies and say that, you know what, there are different fruit flies and different ones are good at resisting starvation. So the average resistance, we could say, is 20 hours. Now, can we breed ones that all the offspring are resistant up to 20 hours from starvation? Can we get rid of all of these traits? So if there's a trait or if there's genetics for only being able to last 19 hours, 10 hours, 5 hours, can we get rid of that? So we could set up an experiment, and you would take a group of fruit flies and you would ultimately starve them for 20 hours, and the ones that were only resistant for 19 hours or less, they would die off. But we'd be left with the ones that were able to survive, and they would we would allow them to reproduce. We would let them to lay eggs. And what we would do with those eggs is we would let them create the next generation. We would have them hatch, and then we would see that maybe somewhere in there, because we talk about recessive genes or recessive alleles, and we talk about dominant alleles, and we talk about how the heterozygotes can hold or can have the recessive allele hidden in there. But over time, we could start weeding those out. And what would happen is eventually you would have all that was left were organisms that were resistant 20 hours or more, resistant to that starvation. So if over many generations you kept breeding them and only using the ones that were resistant 20 hours or more to reproduce, eventually all of them would have the same genes. They would all have that gene for being resistant 20 hours or more. So what we did was we selected for a specific trait. And now we artificially did that, so we call that artificial selection. Sometimes it's called selective breeding. But it happens in nature, and that's what we call natural selection, where the environment is selecting it. And over time, you'd see maybe the first generation would have 23 hours on average as we're starting to weed them out. And then over time, you could eventually have ones that on average they have 160 hours because we continue to weed out the ones that are going to be less resistant, and we let the ones that are more resistant reproduce. And that is how we see that evolution is driven by this selection. As we start to weed out traits, organisms start to become a certain way. So when we talk about evolution, some may say that the definition is genetic change in a population, but remember, it's over a long period of time. We're talking about changing this from 20 hours to 160 hours over 60 generations. Takes a very long time. One generation only shifted the average very little, and that's just for one trait. So for us to look at organisms and see many traits being different, it takes a very long period of time. So how does evolution occur? A consequence of certain individuals in a population being born with characteristics that make them more likely to survive. That is natural selection. That is what drives evolution. So natural selection is what's driving or pushing evolution. Now, what types of changes can evolution cause in a population? These are the mechanisms of evolution that are going to cause these changes. There's 5 primary lines of evidence for evolution and natural selection that we're going to talk about. Now, just as a general history, we talk about Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin came up with the idea for evolution, but before him, it wasn't completely forgotten about or not thought about. There were many men that thought about, or many people that thought about, how is it that organisms exist here, what goes on with them, and different ones believe different things. But it wasn't really until Charles Darwin came along that they started to think that, you know what? Organisms change over a long period of time. They weren't just put here. All right, remember, if you go back hundreds of years, people were very religious. They thought everything was based on God, and whatever was in the Bible, they said that was gospel. So for these people to come along and say that something else happened, it was rather taboo for them to do so. But Charles Darwin, being a naturalist or a science guy, he said, you know what, it just doesn't make sense to say that everything that is here has been here, and nothing has changed. So Darwin was born in 1809, and he went to med school, and his father was a well-to-do doctor in England. He wanted him to make something of himself. He didn't do well in med school, flunked out, and but his father didn't really give up on him. He wanted him to do something, so he got him onto this voyage on the HMS Beagle to travel the world. And he, as a young naturalist or aspiring naturalist, he wanted to make observations and collect data and information. So he made his key observations on the Galapagos Islands, and you'll hear a lot about the Galapagos Islands when we talk about Charles Darwin, because this was back when he went in the 1830s, this was an untouched area, this archipelago or archipelago or group of islands that wasn't really touched by humans. So these organisms, you could see how they were without human influence, and he noticed that there were these strange species there, and they must have become this way because of the dynamics of these islands and the natural selection and the environment that influenced them. And he never really said this term evolution or things evolved. He said that they descended with modification. So over time, things changed as they descended from their parents, or they were went from generation to generation. And he talked about physical traits, and keep in mind this is before they knew about genetics and they knew about dominant alleles and recessive alleles or alleles at all, or they knew about DNA or anything like that. So he really was looking more so at the traits or the phenotypes, even though we didn't know what phenotypes were or anything like that. And he made two important observations. One is that different island finches all resemble the mainland species. So he said, you know what? We have these different finches on these islands, and initially he didn't even know that they were all finches because some of them looked very different. But once he went back, he realized he found out no, they were all finches and they were somewhat related. But he noticed that they did resemble the ones that came from mainland South America. Now, he also noticed that or observed that there was a striking similarity between the fossils of extinct species and the living species in the same area. So when he looked at fossils, he saw, you know what, they might not be exactly the same, but there are some similarities. And in observing the geographic similarities and differences among fossils and living plants and animals, he developed this theory of evolution. And Thomas Malthus wrote this essay on the principles of population, on the principle of population, and he said that populations grow much faster than food supplies. And Darwin said that favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones would be destroyed, as these traits or these variations would either help you to live long enough to reproduce and pass on those traits, or not help you and you wouldn't live long enough to reproduce and pass on those traits. So in 1842, he had this 35-page draft of his idea, but he did not come out with it because he was afraid of the backlash from the scientific community and from people in general, and so he didn't come out with it. And it took about 14 years. He became much older, and then he published it once this guy Alfred Russel Wallace, who actually looked up to Darwin, came to Darwin or wrote to Darwin. He said, you know what, I have this idea, but what do you think about it? And ultimately, it was Charles Darwin's idea. So at this point, Darwin said, you know what, let's not have you take my idea completely. I've been sitting on this for fear of backlash. If you're going to come out with it, though, let's come out with it together. And ultimately, he took all the credit for it. He did have the idea, and then once that happened, he came out with The Origin of Species, which is his famous book about evolution and natural selection and descent with modification. So although he never said evolution, now we call it evolution, and he did discuss natural selection and descent with modification after Alfred Russel Wallace kind of came up with his own idea of evolution by natural selection. So evolution occurs when the allele frequencies in a population change. The amount of alleles or the amount of individuals with a certain allele when it starts to change. So populations of organisms evolve. We never say that individuals evolve. If an individual changes, we say that one individual is a mutant or it mutates. But if a whole population starts to change, that's when we start to see evolution. And some mechanisms of evolution, we talk about mutations, genetic drift, migration, and natural selection. When an allele's market share changes, evolution is taking place. So when an allele is either more beneficial, less beneficial in a specific environment, because keep in mind, it depends on which environment you are in. You can talk about a certain trait, and it might be great in a certain environment, but you can't say that is always the superior trait. If I talk about a trait for being the same color of sand, well, yeah, you're fit for an environment where you have this sandy background. But if you were to be put into a green background where there's a lot of bushes and lush plant life, you're going to see that they're suddenly not so fit for the environment. So when we talk about survival of the fittest, it's really being fit for your environment. It's not survival of the fastest, survival of the strongest, survival of the ones with the biggest teeth, survival of the best camouflage. It's none of those things. It is survival of the fittest. It really depends on which environment that you're talking about. So evolution is a change in the allele frequency found in a population. Now, mutations are going to be these alterations of the base pair sequence of an individual's DNA, the changes in the letters in the DNA or the sequence of the letters, and altering that DNA ultimately alters your mRNA, and that's going to alter your amino acid sequence and your proteins, and you're going to make different proteins, and it's going to create different traits. So only mutations that affect reproductive cells can be passed to offspring. Mutations are random. We cannot predict ahead of time which individuals will have which mutations. We cannot predict whether the consequence of mutation will be benign, harmful, or useful. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're hurtful, sometimes they're neutral. Mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation in a population. So if we go back to talking about our fruit flies, if one of them had some crazy mutation that allowed them to resist starvation for 300 hours, that would be beneficial in our experiment, in that environment that we created, and they would live longer, reproduce more, and eventually that would be the ultimate trait for that scenario, for that environment. Now, mutations either do not impact fitness or cause early death or reduce an organism's reproductive success. Now, when we talk about genetic drift, it's this random change in allele frequencies in a population. It can lead to fixation or an allele's frequency in population where it reaches 100%. And we see that the population or the genetics of that population is going to start moving or drifting towards a specific trait as it is more beneficial for that specific environment. Now, the founder effect we talk about, it occurs when the founding members or the specific members with their specific traits of a new population have different allele frequencies than the original source, and that creates a different population based on the environment ultimately. So we also have a population bottleneck, where if you take a small sample of a population and you put them in a new area or you separate them, well, now they have different amounts different amounts of alleles or different options for alleles, and that is going to change how that population evolves or changes or survives in a separate sect of organisms. Now, migration is also another one. If you are going to move a population, they're now going to be into a new environment, and that those two environments are going to create two different populations with different traits as they are trying to be fit for the environment. Now, the biggest one we talk about is natural selection. And three conditions are necessary for natural selection to occur. There must be variation for a trait within a population. The variation must be heritable. You must be able to pass it on. And individuals with one version of the trait must produce more offspring than those with a different version of the trait. And this is differential reproductive success. So you need to see, does that trait have stress put on it by the environment? So now when we talk about the different conditions, you have variation for a trait is the first one, heritability is the second one, differential reproductive success is the third one. And just as a recap, when we talk about natural selection, you're talking about the way that the environment is going to select which alleles are beneficial for that organism to have in that environment. Now, there's also sexual selection. Now, some traits make individuals more attractive to the opposite sex, and a lot of times these kind of go against what you might think. So bright colored feathers, you might think bright colored feathers, that's going to make you stand out to your predators, and that's true, but it also helps you to reproduce as you're trying to woo the females. And if you're able to woo a female, then you're better at reproducing. Large antlers on male red deer are another one. So sexual selection also plays a part in evolution, even though a lot of times it goes against what you think would help an organism be fit for the environment. Increase in frequency because they satisfy three conditions of natural selection. Natural selection eliminates traits that confer poor reproductive success. And that's where we talk about survival of the fittest. And fitness, or being the fittest, is a measure of the reproductive output of an individual with a particular phenotype relative to the reproductive output of an individual of the same species with an alternative phenotype. So an individual's fitness is measured relative to other genotypes or phenotypes in the population. You see, fitness depends on the specific environment in which the organism lives, and organism's fitness varies across different habitats. You see something like this. Hey, in this habitat, this one is going to be more fit for the environment, but you go in a habitat like this one is going to be more fit. So it's not always going to be the same trait. It really depends on which environment that organism is in, and environments change. We always hear about global warming, or you hear about climate change. Well, the climate is changing, the environments are changing, and that is going to drive evolution as well. That's going to put stress on the traits, and organisms are going to have to be fit for their environment, even if that environment changes. And we talk about reproductive success, which is going to determine whether a trait's frequency will change. The phrase survival of the fittest is kind of misleading. It is the individual with the greatest reproductive output that are the most fit in any population. So when we talk about survival of the fittest and natural selection and evolution, it doesn't really matter how good you think your traits are. It really matters how well is it going to help you live long enough to reproduce and pass on those traits. Now we talk about adaptations, and that's really what you want so that you can live long enough to reproduce, so that you can pass on those traits. It's the process by which organisms become better matched to their environment. Having a specific adaptation is going to help them to fit in with their environment and survive. The specific features that make an organism more fit, those are their adaptations. Now, natural selection does not lead to perfect organisms, okay, does not match towards an optimal endpoint as the environment changes. So average beak size within a population continues to fluctuate according to the food supply, and from one year to the next, the food supply may change, and that might really change what it means to have a perfect beak. So it's not always going to be that you want the biggest beak. Some years you might want a medium beak or a smaller beak, and that is what's really going to see this back and forth and this sculpting of these specific traits. Now, factors that prevent populations from progressing inevitably towards perfection. You're going to have environments change quickly, so it's not always going to be, oh, I want the biggest beak, or I want the smallest beak, or I want the sharpest beak. It really is going to depend on the environment. That environment's always changing. Also, variation is needed as the raw material of selection, which mutations are going to help with that. And there may be multiple different alleles for a trait, each causing an individual to have the same fitness. So it's not always one trait versus the other. One's good, one's bad. Sometimes there could be two different traits, and they're both helpful. Artificial selection is a special case of natural selection where we are doing the selecting. So plant and animal breeders unknowingly understood natural selection long before Darwin did. So before Darwin said about descent with modification and natural selection, there were plant and animal breeders that knew, hey, if I want to breed a dog, I'm going to want to make sure that if I want my dog to be as big as possible, any of the small ones in the litter I'm not breeding, and I'm only breeding the larger ones. Or if I have a plant and I want the plant to have big leaves, well, I'm not going to plant the seeds from the plants that have little leaves. I'm going to get whichever ones out of the ones I planted that have the largest leaves and take those seeds, plant them from them. Whichever ones have the largest leaves, I'm going to take the seeds from that one, plant them, and it'll continue over time. When humans breed for more and more exaggerated versions of a desired trait, we call that selective breeding or artificial selection. We're artificially selecting which traits are best, which traits are fit for their environment, when in reality it's not a matter of if they're fit for their environment, it's a matter of if we want them to survive. So breeding dogs, breeding birds, certain types of plants, things like corn. Once upon a time, corn was very small and had very hard kernels, and we bred corn to be a lot bigger, a lot softer, nice yellow color to it. But that happens over a long period of time by artificially selecting for the traits that we wanted. Now, natural selection can change the traits in your population in several ways. You have trait categorization, which is discussed in the textbook, where there's a specific category, and then you have a continuous range. And we have different types of selection. So directional selection, individuals with one extreme from the range of variation in the population have a higher fitness. You also have stabilizing, where the middle is the best. Individuals with that intermediate phenotype are going to be most fit. And then you have disruptive, where being in the intermediate phenotype isn't good, but being on two ends of the spectrum is going to be the best. Now, natural selection can cause the evolution of complex traits and behaviors. It can co-opt traits. And we see that there's 5 primary lines of evidence for evolution. You have the fossil record, you have biogeography, then you have comparative anatomy and embryology, molecular biology like DNA, and then laboratory and field studies as well. So the fossil record is one of the 5 primary lines of evidence, and we're going to see that fossils are preserved remains of organisms from long ago, and when we look at them, we can compare them to our fossils and see if we can see any connection between what lizards used to look like and what lizards look like now, something like that. You have embryology, looking at the different embryos of different organisms and seeing those connections. We look at homologous structures, where if you look at the bones of a human and you compare them to other organisms, you see that they don't look like similar bones, but we have the same kind of structure to it, where you're going to have one big bone, then you can have these long bones, then you have a bunch of little bones, then you usually have like a hand or a paw or a palm to it. Same goes here. One, then you have long, then you have little bones, then you have finger and hand bones. Same one goes here. One, and these long ones, little ones, and then you have fingers. So the same thing goes for a human. We have this one, then we have 2 here, little ones here, and then we have this palm and fingers to it. Then you have vestigial traits, which are traits that kind of stuck around but are no longer used. Convergent evolution produces these analogous structures as well. So different starting materials come to perform the same function through convergent evolution. So these two are not related, but they both have wings because it helped both of them survive in their environment. Then you have molecular biology, really talking about DNA and the genetic code. An evolutionary clock that we look at, and looking at genetic similarities and differences over time, and looking at mutations and how long it takes for mutations to occur. You have laboratory and field experiments, which are going to help us to build our case and look at the way that evolution and descent with modification, natural selection occur over time. And a great example of natural selection, artificial selection, selective breeding is just the way that we have really ruined antibiotics over time. So once by the time you would take penicillin and it kind of killed all the bacteria, and by doing so, we created this environment where if there were some bacteria around that had some kind of resistance to penicillin, they were able to survive in the presence of penicillin. They were able to continue to reproduce. And what happened is, over time, we kind of weeded out all the ones that didn't have that resistance, and what was left were the ones that did have the resistance. So before you know it, penicillin no longer worked. So we came out with new drugs, and over time, we're weeding out these ones that are not resistant to antibiotics, and we're leaving the ones that are there, and they're able to reproduce. And before you know it, since they're able to reproduce, that's all we're left with. And our antibiotics don't work anymore. So antibiotic resistance is a major issue, and that's why you hear doctors always say that you want to make sure you finish your round of antibiotics, and that's why a lot of times they try not to give you antibiotics unless you really need it. So sometimes they'll tell you, no, I think this is viral, it's not helpful if I give you antibiotics, because they really don't want to write that script for you if they don't have to, because using constant antibiotics is further pushing this antibiotic resistance along, and before you know it, we're not going to have anything to treat anything as far as antibiotics go, and it's going to be a major issue for people. Now, lastly, evolution is occurring all around us. You think about that fruit fly starvation experiment. It shows you how natural selection occurs. There's a grandeur in this view of life, and that from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. So, in the words of Charles Darwin, we started very simple and we are becoming more and more complex, and it's beautiful to see how we can go from simple things and we become more complex as we try to become these perfect organisms in this ever-changing environment. So keep these things in mind as we move forward, talking about how really genetics is part of this evolution, and evolution is really being driven by natural selection, and it's this descent with modification. As over millions and millions of years, the environment is really tinkering with which traits are beneficial, which traits are going to help you to live long enough to pass on those traits to reproduce, live long enough to reproduce to pass on those traits to the next generation that are going to want to live long enough to reproduce to pass on those traits.